Stay with me because what I'm about to walk you through isn't just another trade headline or political spat. For the first time in modern history, an American president looked at the world's longest undefended border, 175 years of peaceful coexistence with our closest ally, and said three words that shocked everyone. We don't need Canada. And I'm not exaggerating. These weren't slips of the tongue. These were deliberate, calculated statements. Today, I'm going to show you why those three words might be one of the most economically misguided claims ever made by an American president, and why the consequences are far bigger than most people realize. Let's start with energy, because this is where the fantasy of American independence collides head-on with reality. Every single day, 4.1 million barrels of Canadian crude oil flow into the United States. That's more than we import from any other country. In fact, 63% of all foreign oil in 2024 came from Canada. And it's not just about convenience. American refineries, especially the massive ones along the Gulf Coast, weren't designed to process any type of crude. They were built specifically for heavy, sulfur-rich oil from Canadian oil sands. About that for a second. These refineries represent decades of investment, billions of dollars, and highly specialized infrastructure. Replacing that overnight? Practically impossible. Where would the oil come from instead? Venezuela's production is at historic lows. Mexico is declining. The Middle East could technically supply some crude, but rerouting supplies, reconfiguring refineries, and relying on a region with unstable politics isn't something you fix with a phone call. Not even close. Canada also supplies 98% of U.S. natural gas imports. Yes, 98%. That means when homes in the Midwest heat up during winter, when power plants in the Northeast generate electricity, that energy is overwhelmingly coming from Canadian pipelines. And electricity itself. Canada provides 82% of all electricity imported by the United States. States like New York, Michigan, and Minnesota, they aren't buying Canadian power as a bonus. They rely on it to meet peak demand and prevent blackouts. In total, the energy trade between the U.S. and Canada was valued at $151 billion in 2024. That's American businesses, utilities, and consumers relying on Canadian energy every single day because it's reliable nearby, and exactly what their infrastructure was built to use. So when the president says, "We don't need Canada," he's essentially claiming the U.S. doesn't need 63% of our crude imports, 98% of natural gas, and 82% of electricity imports. In other words, he's saying we don't need functioning refineries, heated homes in winter, or stable power grids. And anyone who thinks that's hyperbole hasn't spent a single winter in Minnesota or looked at a refinery schedule. But energy is just the beginning. Canada was the top destination for U.S. goods exports in 2024. American businesses exported $350 billion in goods to Canada while importing $413 billion. That's a trade deficit of roughly $62 billion. But here's what most people miss. When you include services, the U.S. actually runs a surplus. Half of the trade between the U.S. and Canada isn't finished goods. It's components, raw materials, and intermediate goods moving back and forth. Take the automotive industry, for example. A Chevy Silverado might use steel from Ontario, be shipped to Ohio for assembly, then return to Canada for parts, and finally come back to the U.S. as a finished vehicle. That's not exploitation. It's integration so deep it's hard to say where one economy ends and the other begins. Canada doesn't have the luxury of diversifying away from the U.S. overnight. 76% of Canadian merchandise exports go to the United States. But here, the key, that dependence works both ways. When the U.S. imposed 25% tariffs in early 2025, Canadian exports plunged 26% in just a few months. Manufacturing slowed, layoffs happened, and businesses scrambled. But the U.S. wasn't spared either. Imports fell 20% in April 2025, the largest monthly drop outside of the 2009 financial crisis. American manufacturers paid more for Canadian steel, margins were crushed, layoffs quietly planned, and inflation started creeping up. The consequences aren't just economic. For the first time in modern history, a Canadian Prime Minister told citizens that their country could no longer trust the United States. The president repeatedly suggested Canada should be annexed as the 51st state, mocked Canadian leaders, and treated the nation like a property deal. Canadian public opinion exploded. 90% opposed annexation, and 82% said they'd rather rejoin the British Commonwealth than become part of the U.S. Canadian nationalism surged. Consumers avoided American products, businesses diversified trade to Europe and Asia, and provinces even discussed cutting off energy exports to U.S. states. This rhetoric isn't diplomacy. It's a fundamental denial of Canadian sovereignty, and international observers are watching closely. If the U.S. treats Canada this way, what does that mean for smaller nations that rely on American security guarantees? Trust, once broken, doesn't come back overnight. Now imagine, hypothetically, Canada stopped exporting energy tomorrow. Gulf Coast refineries would scramble for 4 million barrels per day of heavy crude. Gasoline prices would spike. Heating costs would soar. Blackouts could become likely in the Northeast. Economic damage wouldn't be measured in billions, it could reach trillions. That's the reality of claiming we don't need Canada. American infrastructure, supply chains, and energy security are built on Canadian reliability. Trade would suffer too. U.S. exports to Canada totaled $350 billion in 2024. Tariffs caused serious disruption, and the KOSMA review in 2026 threatens further collapse. Economists predict Canada's GDP could shrink by 2.6%, while the U.S. economy could lose $467 billion, a cost of about $1,300 per American per year, just to punish Canada economically. And for what? The stated goals, border security and fentanyl, don't even involve Canada. Meanwhile, Canadian businesses are diversifying away from the U.S., building new relationships in Europe and Asia. Every supply chain avoided, every alternative buyer found, every investment bypassing the U.S. is a permanent loss of influence. Other allies are watching closely, preparing for a world where the U.S. is less central, less reliable, and less essential. The real cost of "we don't need Canada" isn't a trade deficit or a few months of tariffs. It's the slow erosion of American influence. Supply chains that took decades to build are dismantled in months. Relationships that survived wars and recessions crumble over trade disputes that shouldn't exist. Trust that took generations to build evaporates because one president decided gut feelings about trade matter more than decades of integration. America might not think it needs Canada, but mathematics doesn't lie. The 4 million barrels of oil per day, the 98% of natural gas, the 82% of electricity, the $350 billion in exports. These numbers are the foundation of the U.S. economy. Declaring them irrelevant doesn't change reality. Reality always wins. Can the U.S. maintain the world's largest economy while alienating its closest ally? Can it impose tariffs on half its imports without triggering inflation, job losses, and economic contraction? Can it treat allies like adversaries and remain trusted globally? The early results are not encouraging. And while the future is uncertain, every day this continues, the economic damage compounds. When historians look back, they'll point to those three words: "We don't need Canada." They encapsulate everything wrong with treating international relations like a negotiation, confusing dependence with weakness, and believing raw power can replace partnership. America might not think it needs Canada, but the math, supply chains, and decades of integration tell a very different story. Reality, sooner or later, always wins. If this breakdown helped you understand the real stakes behind the headlines, hit that like button and subscribe for more in-depth analysis. And in the comments, I want to know, do you think the US-Canada relationship can recover, or are we witnessing something breaking in real time?